In the rugged heart of Wyoming's Wind River Valley, a moment of disrespect is about to trigger an explosion that no one sees coming. At the last stand trading post, where cowboys and millionaires cross paths, a Silicon Valley titan is about to learn the deadly price of arrogance. Richard Sterling, with his $5,000 suit and contempt for local ways, thinks he's dealing with just another worn-down cowboy in dusty boots. He couldn't be more wrong. John Mason isn't your typical ranch hand. For 20 years, he was the most decorated Navy SEAL commander in U.S. Special Operations, leading missions that will remain classified for decades. His call sign was Shadow, the ghost that brought America's enemies to their knees. Now he's about to teach a powerful man that true strength doesn't come from money or status. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn broke over the last stand trading post like it had for the past century, painting the weathered wooden walls in shades of amber and gold. The building stood as a testament to time, its broad front porch worn smooth by generations of boots, its windows reflecting the first light of day across the Wind River Valley. Inside, Sarah Mitchell worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew every creaking floorboard, every dusty corner of her family's legacy. At 42, Sarah carried herself with the kind of strength that came from years of keeping a business. Alive in a changing world, her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, laugh lines around her eyes, telling stories of both joy and struggle. The trading post had been in her family for 3 generations, evolving from a frontier necessity to a community hub that served both local ranchers and the increasing number of tourists drawn to Wyoming's wild beauty. John Mason pushed open the heavy front door at exactly 6:15 a.m., same as every morning. His worn boots moved silently across the old wooden floor, his presence somehow both commanding and understated. At first glance, he looked like any other rancher: worn jeans, faded denim shirt, weathered cowboy hat pulled low. But there was something in the way he moved, a fluid grace that spoke of far more than ranch work, though few ever noticed. "Morning, Sarah." His voice was quiet, carrying just far enough to reach her ears. She smiled, already reaching for his usual order: black coffee in the chrome thermal cup he'd been bringing in for the past year. "John," she nodded, studying him as she did every morning. Despite knowing him for 12 months, she felt she'd barely scratched the surface. He worked the Mason Creek Ranch 10 miles out, lived alone except for his horses, and never spoke more than necessary. But when he did speak, people listened. The morning routine played out like a well-rehearsed dance. John would sip his coffee, scan the morning paper, and listen as local ranchers filtered in, sharing news and concerns about everything from cattle prices to weather patterns. He rarely contributed to these conversations, but Sarah noticed how he absorbed every detail, his eyes missing nothing. The trading post itself was a marvel of organized chaos. Original shelving from the 1800s held everything from premium ranch gear to tourist trinkets. The old brass cash register sat beside a modern credit card terminal, a perfect symbol of how the post straddled past and present. The smell of coffee, leather, and wood polish mixed with the crisp morning air that drifted through the open windows. More regulars arrived as the morning wore on. Jake Thompson, whose family had ranched the valley for 4 generations, came in complaining about dropping cattle prices. Mary White Eagle from the reservation stopped by with her handmade jewelry, which Sarah proudly displayed in the front case. Each person greeted John with a respectful nod, sensing something in his quiet demeanor that commanded deference without demanding it. Sarah watched as John helped Mary carry her heavy boxes of craft supplies, his movements betraying a strength that his lean frame concealed. She'd seen glimpses of other things too: the way he could calm a spooked horse with just his presence, how he seemed to know when trouble was brewing before anyone else. the mysterious phone calls he sometimes received on the satellite phone he carried, but it was the scars that really made her wonder. One day, when he'd reached for a high shelf, his shirt had risen just enough to reveal precise lines across his back, the kind that spoke of combat, not ranch accidents. She never asked, and he never offered explanations. That was part of the trading post's code. Respect people's privacy, judge them by their actions, not their past. By mid-morning, the post had settled into its familiar rhythm. Tourists wandered in, drawn by the authentic Western atmosphere, snapping photos of the original wood stove and the antique saddles displayed on the walls. John had moved to his usual spot by the window, seemingly absorbed in his paper, but watching everything with those quiet, observant eyes. The morning light streamed through dust motes, creating halos around the old photographs of frontier life that lined the walls. Sarah's great-grandfather stared sternly from one frame, standing proud in front of the newly built trading post in 1889. Below it, newspaper clippings chronicled the post's history, surviving the Depression, adapting to changing times, standing as a cornerstone of the community through it all. The black Range Rover looked alien against the trading post's weathered wood, its mirror-polished surface reflecting the late morning sun like a shard of obsidian. Richard Sterling emerged from the driver's seat, his movements precise and deliberate, Italian leather shoes crunching on the gravel parking lot. At 55, he carried success like armor, tailored suit, perfect haircut, the confident stride of a man used to bending the world to his will. "Quaint," he muttered, adjusting his Rolex as he surveyed the trading post. Behind him, two younger men in business casual attire climbed out of the vehicle, tablets in hand. Mark Chen and David Walsh, Sterling Ventures' advance team, had spent the last month analyzing the valley's economic weaknesses. "Property values are at historic lows," Chen reported, swiping through digital charts. "The droughts hit the ranchers hard. Most are leveraged to the hilt, just keeping their operations running. Perfect timing for our resort development plan." Sterling nodded, already seeing past the present reality to his vision of the future. Where others saw an aging trading post, he saw the centerpiece of a luxury Western experience. The surrounding ranches would make perfect golf courses and luxury cabin sites. His investors in Singapore were eager to capitalize on wealthy tourists' desire for an authentic Western experience, carefully curated and sanitized for their comfort, of course. Inside the trading post, the temperature seemed to drop as Sterling entered. Conversations died mid-sentence as locals recognized him from the news. His reputation had preceded him. The tech billionaire turned real estate mogul who transformed 3 other rural communities into upscale tourist destinations. Not everyone in those communities had benefited from the transformation. "Ms. Mitchell?" Sterling approached the counter, his smile practiced and perfect. "I hope you've had time to consider my offer." His voice carried just enough volume to ensure everyone could hear. Power plays were his specialty, and public pressure was just another tool in his arsenal. Sarah straightened, her face composed, but her hands tight on the counter's edge. "Mr. Sterling, I received your proposal. As I said in my email, the trading post isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale." Sterling's smile didn't waver. "It's just a matter of finding the right price. Your property is key to our development plans. The historic nature of this building would make it perfect as the reception area for our resort complex. We're prepared to offer 3 times market value." From his spot by the window, John Mason watched the exchange silently, his paper forgotten. In his hands, other regulars shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the implied threat in Sterling's words. They'd seen his type before. Men who mistook money for power, who thought everything and everyone had a price. "This post has been in my family for 4 generations." Sarah's voice was firm. "It's not just a building, Mr. Sterling. It's the heart of this community." Sterling's smile tightened fractionally. He wasn't used to rejection, especially from what he viewed as a struggling small business owner. Communities change, Ms. Mitchell. Progress is inevitable. I'd hate to see you left behind when the valley transforms. Property taxes have a way of rising unexpectedly, and maintaining historic buildings can become prohibitively expensive. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Jake Thompson muttered something under his breath, but a quick look from Sarah kept him quiet. This wasn't the first confrontation with Sterling, and it wouldn't be the last. Now then, Sterling continued, his voice smoothly shifting to address the room at large. I'm hosting a presentation at the county meeting hall next week. Everyone's invited to learn about the exciting changes coming to Wind River Valley. New jobs, improved infrastructure, real economic growth. The future is coming, whether we're ready or not. He turned to leave, then paused, his gaze falling on John Mason. Something in the quiet rancher's steady stare made Sterling's skin prickle. He wasn't used to being looked at that way, like he was being assessed, measured, found wanting. You might want to update your reading material, Sterling said sharply, nodding at John's worn newspaper. The world's digital now. Paper's obsolete, just like, he gestured around the trading post, all of this. John said nothing, just held Sterling's gaze until the businessman looked away first. It was a small moment, unnoticed by most, but it sent a ripple of unease through Sterling's confident facade. He covered it quickly with a dismissive shrug and strode out, his team trailing behind him. The Range Rover's engine growled to life, throwing gravel as it accelerated away. Inside the trading post, conversations slowly resumed, but the tension remained. Sarah let out a long breath, her hands finally relaxing their grip on the counter. That man, Jake Thompson spat, is a rattlesnake in expensive boots. He's worse than that, Mary White Eagle said quietly. At least a rattler warns you before it strikes. The afternoon sun beat down on the trading post's back lot as John Mason worked with a young stallion that Jake Thompson had brought in. The horse was considered unrideable, dangerous after a bad experience with an abusive previous owner. But John moved around it with a calm confidence that seemed to affect the animal immediately. Never seen anything like it, Jake muttered to Sarah, who had stepped out to watch. That horse nearly killed my best ranch hand last week. Now look at him. The stallion stood perfectly still as John ran his hands along its flanks, his touch seemingly knowing exactly where to apply pressure. His movements were precise, economical, reflecting years of experience that went beyond simple horse training. Sarah noticed how he always kept himself positioned to react instantly if the horse spooked, his situational awareness extending to every corner of the lot. It's not about dominating them, John spoke softly, more to the horse than his observers. It's about earning their trust. Animals know when you respect them. His words carried a deeper wisdom, earned through experiences he never discussed. Commotion from the front of the trading post drew their attention. Young Tommy White Eagle, Mary's 16-year-old son, came running around the corner, his face streaked with tears. "Mr. Mason, they're trying to take our horses." John's reaction was instant but controlled. He secured the stallion with practiced efficiency, his movements fluid as he turned to Tommy. "What happened?" "Bank representatives," Tommy gasped. "They came with papers, said we're behind on payments. They're loading our horses right now." Sarah saw something flash in John's eyes, a hardness that transformed his entire demeanor. "Jake, watch this stallion." "Sarah, my truck keys are on the counter. Tommy, show me where." They took John's old Ford pickup, driving fast but careful down the dusty road to the White Eagle Ranch. As they approached, they saw two men in business, suits supervising as workers loaded horses into a trailer. Mary stood helplessly by, clutching paperwork. John parked the truck and stepped out, his boots hitting the ground with deliberate purpose. His usual quiet demeanor had shifted into something else, a commanding presence that made everyone, including the bank representatives, stop what they were doing. "Those horses," John's voice carried across the yard, "aren't going anywhere." "This is a legal repossession," one of the suits started, waving papers. "The loan is in default and—" "The loan," John interrupted, pulling out his satellite phone, "was fraudulent. Mary White Eagle filed complaints about predatory lending practices 3 months ago. There's an ongoing investigation." The bank representatives exchanged uneasy glances. "That's not our concern. We have orders to—" "Call your supervisor." John's voice was quiet, but carried an unmistakable authority. "Ask them about case number 47B9321. Tell them John Mason is requesting a review." Something in his tone made the lead representative step away to make a call. Sarah watched in amazement as the man's face went pale during the conversation. Within minutes, the workers were unloading the horses. "There's been a misunderstanding," the representative stammered. "We'll need to review these documents back at the office. Mrs. White Eagle, please accept our apologies for the confusion." As they hurriedly departed, Mary turned to John with tears in her eyes. "How did you—" "Let's just say, I know some people who investigate banking fraud," John replied simply. "Your case caught their attention. The lending practices used here weren't exactly legal." Sarah studied him as he helped Tommy calm the agitated horses. She'd seen glimpses of John's hidden depths before, but this was different. The way he'd handled the situation spoke of connections and influence that went far beyond what a simple rancher should have. Later, back at the trading post, Sarah finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "John, who are you, really?" He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes holding secrets she couldn't begin to guess. "Just someone who believes in fighting for what's right," he answered finally. "Sometimes that means working with horses. Sometimes it means making a few phone calls." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the trading post's weathered porch, Sarah realized that John Mason was becoming something more than just their quiet, regular customer. In a valley under siege from forces threatening their way of life, he was emerging as a silent guardian, his strength lying not in loud declarations, but in decisive actions and unwavering principles. The day's events had revealed just enough about John to make his mysteries even more intriguing. As he drove away in his pickup, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what other surprises lay behind those watchful eyes and quiet demeanor. One thing was certain: there was far more to John Mason than anyone in Wind River Valley had imagined. The trading post was unusually crowded for a Thursday morning. Sterling had called a community meeting to discuss his development plans, and the old building's walls seemed to strain against the pressure of contained tension. Local ranchers lined the walls, their faces set in stone, while Sterling's team had set up a sleek digital presentation system that looked jarringly out of place among the vintage saddles and worn wood. John Mason sat in his usual spot by the window, seemingly absorbed in his newspaper, but watching everything with careful attention. Sarah moved between the coffee counter and the gathered crowd, her nervous energy evident in every step. Sterling stood at the front, his $5,000 suit a deliberate statement of power. "The reality is," he gestured to digital charts, "displaying declining agricultural revenues. This valley is dying, your way of life is becoming obsolete, but we're offering you a lifeline. By turning our ranches into golf courses," Jake Thompson's voice carried decades of ranching pride. "By bringing you into the 21st century, Sterling countered smoothly, "our resort development will create hundreds of jobs. Your children won't have to leave the valley to find opportunities. Progress is inevitable, gentlemen. The question is whether you'll profit from it or be left behind." The tension in the room ratcheted up as Sterling clicked to the next slide, showing architectural renderings of the trading post transformed into an upscale resort reception area. Sarah's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. "Of course," Sterling continued, his voice dripping with calculated condescension. "Some of you might need help adapting to the new economy. We'll offer training programs. Even the most—" His gaze settled deliberately on John. "Limited individuals can find a place in our organization, perhaps as parking attendants or stable hands." The insult hung in the air like smoke. John slowly folded his newspaper, his movements deliberate and controlled. The room had gone deathly quiet. Small minds often mistake silence for weakness. John's voice was quiet, but carried to every corner. "And wealth for wisdom." Sterling's face flushed red. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. "I don't think you understand your position here, Cowboy. Men like you are relics, playing at a lifestyle that's already dead. I could buy and sell this entire valley without denting my portfolio." John stood, his movement causing Sterling's security guard to tense. "Money doesn't make the man, Mr. Sterling. Neither does an expensive suit or practiced words." "And what would you know about it?" Sterling sneered, gaining confidence from his security team's presence. "Look at you, worn boots, shabby clothes. Probably can't even read those financial projections I'm showing. I've made more money in the last hour than you'll see in a lifetime." The security guard smirked, and Sterling pressed his advantage. "Do you want to know the difference between us? I build empires while you clean horse stalls. I create futures while you cling to a dying past. You're nothing but a washed-up cowboy who—" "That's enough," John's voice cut through Sterling's tirade. Like a steel blade, something in his tone, in the way he held himself, made Sterling take an involuntary step back. For just a moment, the businessman glimpsed something behind John's calm exterior, something that sent a primal warning signal, straight to his brain. "You measure a man's worth by his wallet," John continued, each word precise and measured. "That's a dangerous mistake, one you're about to regret." Sterling recovered quickly, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "Is that a threat, Cowboy?" "No, Mr. Sterling, that's a fact." John turned to leave, but paused at the door. "You might want to have your team do better research before your next investment, starting with who actually owns controlling interest in most of this valley's water rights." He walked out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Sterling's team immediately huddled over their tablets, whispering urgently. Sarah watched them with growing interest, noting how their faces shifted from confusion to shock. "Sir," Chen finally spoke, his voice shaking slightly, We need to make some calls right now." The meeting dissolved into chaos as Sterling's team rushed out, leaving their expensive presentation equipment behind. The local ranchers exchanged knowing looks, sensing that something significant had just happened, even if they didn't understand. "What?" Sarah picked up John's discarded newspaper, noticing for the first time that it was the Wall Street Journal's international edition, open to a page about global water rights acquisitions. She smiled, beginning to understand that the quiet Cowboy had just played the first card in what promised to be a very interesting game. The hours following Sterling's humiliation brought a whirlwind of activity to the Last Stand trading post. Sarah watched through the front windows as expensive cars and SUVs raced back and forth along the valley road, Sterling's team scrambling to gather information they should have collected weeks ago. "You should have seen their faces," Jake Thompson chuckled, nursing his coffee at the counter. Like someone told them their golden goose was actually a rattlesnake. Sarah was more interested in the satellite phone call John had taken outside, his voice too low to hear, but his posture radiating authority. Through the window, she could see him speaking with the kind of confident command that came from years of giving orders that were always obeyed. Mary White Eagle entered, her eyes bright with excitement. Just heard from my cousin at the county records office. Sterling's people are going crazy trying to trace water rights ownership. Seems most of them were quietly bought up through a series of shell companies over the past 5 years. Shell companies? Sarah raised an eyebrow. Any idea who's behind them? That's the interesting part, Mary lowered her voice. The paperwork leads back to a private investment group specializing in sustainable rural development. They've been buying up water rights all across the West, but only in places where family farms and ranches are under corporate pressure. The trading post door opened, and John stepped back inside. The conversation died immediately, but not from discomfort. There was a new respect in the way people looked at him, a growing awareness that they were seeing only the surface of a much deeper story. "Mr. Mason," Tommy White Eagle burst in, clutching his phone. "You're trending on social media. Someone filmed the whole thing with Sterling, and people are trying to figure out who you are. There are all these theories." "Tommy," John's quiet voice carried a gentle warning, and the teenager fell silent, but his excitement couldn't be contained. "It's just the way you stood up to him. Nobody ever does that to Richard Sterling. He's worth billions. He destroys people who get in his way, but you weren't afraid at all." John's response was measured but carried weight. "Fear is a choice, Tommy. So is respect. Sterling never learned the difference." Sarah noticed how he deflected attention from himself, but she also saw something else. The way he scanned exits whenever someone entered, how he positioned himself to see both the front door and the back room, the deliberate way he moved that spoke of thousands of hours of training. The satellite phone buzzed again. This time, Sarah caught a glimpse of the caller ID before John stepped outside, a Washington, D.C. area code. "He's not just some cowboy, is he?" she asked Mary quietly. Mary shook her head. "My brother works at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Says there are rumors about a former military officer who's been quietly helping native communities protect their water rights from corporate takeovers. Someone with high-level connections and the financial knowledge to beat companies at their own game." Outside, Sterling's Range Rover roared past again, kicking up dust. But this time, Sarah noticed the subtle change in the businessman's demeanor through the tinted windows. The forward hunch of someone who had just realized they were in over their head. "Sterling's used to being the biggest predator in the Valley," Jake observed. "Must be quite a shock to discover he's been playing in someone else's territory all along." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trading post's windows as the day wound down. John's quiet presence in his usual spot provided a sense of stability, but Sarah could feel the currents of change swirling around them. Sterling's insults had cracked a carefully maintained facade, offering a glimpse of something powerful beneath. Whatever storm was coming, she realized John Mason had been preparing for it long before Sterling ever set foot in Wind River Valley. The quiet Cowboy was playing a much deeper game, and they were about to witness a masterclass in strategy. The first signs of Sterling's retaliation came swiftly. Health inspectors descended on the trading post at dawn, armed with clipboards and suspicious anonymous tips. Tax auditors appeared at local ranches, citing irregularities that required immediate investigation. It was a calculated display of power, meant to remind everyone just how much influence money could buy. But John Mason wasn't at the trading post to witness any of it. For the first time in a year, he missed his morning coffee. Sarah discovered why when she opened the Wall Street Journal that afternoon. The business section carried a small but significant story about water rights acquisitions in the American West. It mentioned a private investment group, Keystone Rural Development, and its founder, a former Navy SEAL commander who had transformed his military pension into a billion-dollar empire specializing in protecting agricultural communities from corporate takeovers. The article didn't name names, but it did mention that the founder had received the Congressional Medal of Honor for actions in Afghanistan that remained classified. It also noted his unique investment strategy, buying controlling interests in water rights, then using that leverage to force corporate developers to work with local communities rather than exploit them. "I'll be damned," Jake whispered, reading, over Sarah's shoulder. "Our quiet cowboy's been playing chess while Sterling's been playing checkers." A black SUV pulled up outside, but this one wasn't part of Sterling's fleet. The man who stepped out wore a crisp military uniform, his bearing unmistakably that of a senior officer. Sarah recognized the Navy insignia of a vice admiral. "Is John around?" he asked politely, removing his cover as he entered the trading post. "Got a bit of business to discuss with my former SEAL." Before Sarah could respond, Sterling burst through the door, his usual polish cracking around the edges. "Mason, where is he? Do you have any idea what he's done? My investors are pulling out. He's threatening the entire project with these water rights." The Admiral turned slowly, fixing Sterling with a look that could have frozen hell. "Mr. Sterling, perfect timing. I'm Vice Admiral James Cooper. I believe you've been harassing one of my best former operators." Sterling's face went from red to white. "Former operators? Commander John Mason," Cooper said clearly, ensuring everyone in the now silent trading post could hear. 20 years in the SEALs, led some of the most successful counter-terrorism operations in history. More importantly, he spent the last 5 years protecting communities like this one from corporate raiders who mistake money for might. The Admiral's words hung in the air as Sterling processed their implications. He wasn't just dealing with some rural cowboy. He was facing a highly trained military commander with both the tactical experience and financial resources to destroy his entire operation. That's impossible," Sterling stammered. "He's just a rancher, lives in that old cabin up on Mason Creek." "The cabin that used to be a SEAL training facility?" Cooper raised an eyebrow. "One of our most sophisticated rural operation centers, disguised as a ranch. John bought it when we decommissioned it. Said something about it being perfect for his new mission." Sarah remembered all the times she'd seen John helping locals with their problems, mediating disputes, finding solutions to financial troubles, quietly supporting those in need. She'd attributed it to kindness, but now she saw the strategic mind behind those actions. He'd been building a community network, strengthening the valley against exactly this kind of corporate invasion. The trading post's door opened again, and John walked in, dressed as always in his worn ranch clothes. But now Sarah saw what others had missed, the way he instantly assessed the room, the confident stride of a man who had led troops into battle, the subtle nod of respect he exchanged with the Admiral. "Jim?" John's voice carried warmth as he greeted his former superior. "Didn't expect to see you in uniform." "Thought it might help clarify things for Mr. Sterling here," Cooper grinned. "Speaking of which, those water rights you've acquired, Pentagon's very interested in preventing foreign investment groups from controlling strategic resources. Might need your expertise on a broader scale." Sterling looked between the two men, his worldview visibly shifting. The quiet cowboy he'd insulted wasn't just some local obstacle to be bulldozed. He was a highly decorated military commander with powerful connections and a proven track record of beating corporate giants at their own game. "We should talk, Mr. Sterling," John said quietly, "about the future of this valley and how your development plans might need some adjustment." The businessman swallowed hard, nodding quickly. His carefully constructed power play had just been turned inside out, and he knew it. As Sterling followed John and the Admiral to a back room for their discussion, Sarah caught a glimpse of something else in John's bearing: the weight of command, the responsibility of leadership, the strategic mind that had earned him not just military honors, but also the respect of the financial world. The quiet cowboy had finally revealed his true depth, and Wind River Valley would never be quite the same. Sterling's response to the revelation of John's identity came in waves. First, a team of private investigators descended on Wind River Valley, digging into every aspect of John Mason's past. Then came the lawyers, filing challenges to water rights, transfers and property acquisitions. But it was the media assault that showed Sterling's true desperation. "Local hero or hidden billionaire?" the headlines screamed. News vans clogged the Trading Post's parking lot, reporters hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious former SEAL commander who had outmaneuvered one of tech's most notorious corporate raiders. "They're calling you the Cowboy Commander on Twitter," Tommy White Eagle announced, holding up his phone. The Trading Post had become an unlikely command center, with locals gathering to share information and coordinate their response to Sterling's pressure tactics. John, characteristically, ignored the media circus. He sat at his usual spot, but now Sarah noticed how others naturally oriented themselves around him, a lifetime of military command creating an unconscious orbit of authority. "Sterling's trying to paint you as some kind of wealthy elite playing cowboy," Jake reported, dropping a stack of newspapers on the counter. "Says you're no different from him, just another rich man trying to control the valley." "Money's just a tool," John replied quietly, his eyes on the satellite phone where updates from his financial team scrolled past. "Like any tool, what matters is how you use it." Sarah watched him coordinate with local ranchers, providing legal support and financial backing to fight Sterling's intimidation tactics. His wealth might equal Sterling's, but he wielded it like he had led his SEAL teams, with precision, purpose, and a clear mission to protect. "Sir," Tommy burst in, excitement overriding his usual respect for John's privacy. "You've got to see this. Someone leaked footage from one of your classified missions. The one where you saved that village in Afghanistan." The room fell silent as Tommy held up his phone. The grainy video showed a younger John Mason leading a team through heavy fire to evacuate civilians from a war zone. His calm commands and selfless courage were unmistakable, even in the poor quality footage. "That's not for public consumption, Tommy," John said firmly but gently. "Some things should stay classified." "But people need to know who you really are," Tommy protested. "Sterling's trying to make you look bad, but you're a hero." "Actions speak louder than medals," John replied, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "What matters isn't what I did there, but what we do here now." The Trading Post's door chimed as Mary White Eagle entered, her face tight with concern. "Sterling's people are at the reservation. They're offering individual buyouts, trying to split the tribal council's unity on water rights." John nodded, unsurprised. Divide and conquer, classic tactic when force fails. He pulled out his phone, sending a quick text. "The tribal council should be receiving documents right now showing how Sterling's previous developments affected native lands, including some details his lawyers tried very hard to keep sealed." Sarah marveled at how he thought several moves ahead, always anticipating and countering Sterling's plays before they fully developed. This wasn't just about money or power. It was about protecting a way of life, and John fought for it with the same strategic brilliance that had made him a legendary SEAL commander. The afternoon brought news that Sterling had called an emergency board meeting of his development company. Through the Trading Post's windows, they watched his convoy of black SUVs speed toward the county airport. "Running away?" Jake asked hopefully. "Regrouping," John corrected, his tactical assessment automatic. "He's got too much invested to give up. This is just the first round." As if to confirm his words, Sarah's phone buzzed with an alert. Sterling Ventures had just announced a hostile takeover bid for Keystone Rural Development, John's company. The offer was significantly above market value, a clear attempt to gain control of the water rights that protected the valley. John read the news without reaction, but Sarah saw his jaw tighten slightly. Sterling was escalating, turning this into a high-stakes battle that would be fought in boardrooms as well as the valley. "What now?" Sarah asked quietly, seeing the worry in the faces around her. John stood, his movement drawing every eye in the room. For a moment, she saw him as his SEAL teams must have. A natural leader who inspired confidence not through loud speeches, but through calm competence and unwavering resolve. "Now," he said, "we show Sterling the difference between attacking a target and fighting for home." His voice carried absolute certainty. "He thinks this is about money. He's about to learn it's about something far more valuable." The gathered locals nodded, understanding that the real battle was just beginning. Sterling had wealth, corporate power, and an army of lawyers. But they had something stronger. A community united behind a leader who had spent his life protecting what mattered most. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the trading post's weathered porch, Sarah realized that Sterling's greatest mistake hadn't been insulting John Mason. It had been assuming that a man's worth could be measured in dollars rather than deeds. The morning sun hadn't yet cleared the mountains when John's satellite phone lit up with urgent messages. Sterling's team had been busy overnight, filing injunctions, preparing media releases, and mobilizing corporate resources for what they thought would be a decisive strike against Keystone Rural Development. "They're moving faster than expected," Sarah overheard John telling Admiral Cooper on a secure line. "Yes, exactly like Kandahar. When you're losing, you push all your chips in and hope for shock and awe." The trading post had transformed into an impromptu operations center. Local ranchers brought reports of Sterling's agents attempting to pressure vulnerable families into quick sales. Mary White Eagle's tribal contacts shared details of corporate representatives making veiled threats about future water access. "Classic siege tactics," John explained to the gathered community leaders, his military experience showing through. "Cut off resources, isolate targets, then pick them off one by one." His calm analysis helped steady nerves, transforming fear into focused resistance. What Sterling didn't realize was that John had anticipated this escalation. Years of special operations had taught him to prepare for every contingency, and his response was already in motion. "Tommy," John called the teenager over, "remember that drone photography you do for your YouTube channel? Time to put those skills to work." He handed Tommy a professional-grade camera. "Document everything, every corporate vehicle, every conversation, every pressure tactic." Sarah watched John deploy the community like a seasoned commander positioning his forces. Jake Thompson's ranch hands became reconnaissance, tracking Sterling's team's movements. Mary's extensive family network turned into an early warning system. Each person had a role, their everyday skills repurposed for the valley's defense. "Sir," Tommy rushed in, breathless from running. "Sterling's people are at the bank, trying to pressure them into calling in loans early." John nodded, unsurprised. Right on schedule. He picked up his phone, dialing a number from memory. "Ms. Chen, execute Operation Firewall." He turned to the worried faces around him. The bank's about to discover that their parent company is now partly owned by Keystone Rural Development. Hostile loan practices would violate their new corporate governance rules. A slow smile spread across Jake's face as he understood. "You weren't just buying water rights all these years. You were building a defensive network." "In special operations, we learned that the best defense isn't always a direct confrontation," John explained. "Sometimes it's about controlling the battlefield before the fight begins." Sarah saw it now, how John had spent years quietly positioning pieces across a board much larger than Wind River Valley. Each investment, each connection, each relationship had been carefully cultivated for exactly this kind of situation. The satellite phone buzzed again. John listened briefly, then allowed himself a small smile. Sterling's hostile takeover bid just hit an unexpected snag. Seems several of his major investors have concerns about his recent track record with rural development projects. Would these be the same investors who recently received detailed files about his previous environmental violations? Sarah asked, beginning to appreciate the depths of John's strategic thinking. "Information is better than ammunition," John replied, the SEAL commander briefly visible behind the quiet rancher. "Sterling fights with money and threats. We fight with truth and community." As the day progressed, reports filtered in of Sterling's offensive faltering on multiple fronts. The media narrative was shifting, painting him as a corporate raider facing unified local resistance rather than the harbinger of progress he'd tried to portray. "You've been planning this defense for years," Sarah realized, watching John coordinate responses across multiple fronts. "Everything, the water rights, the quiet investments, even your role as the humble rancher, it was all preparation." John looked up from his satellite phone, his eyes showing a depth of strategy she was only beginning to understand. "In the SEALs, we learned that the most effective operations are the ones the enemy never sees coming." Sterling thought he was dealing with a simple ranching community. He never stopped to ask why this particular valley had such well-organized water, rights and financial structures. The trading post's old walls had witnessed many changes over the generations, but never anything quite like this. A covert defensive operation run by a legendary SEAL commander disguised as a quiet cowboy, using Wall Street tactics to protect Main Street values. As evening approached, bringing news of Sterling's growing frustration and increasingly desperate moves, Sarah understood that the real battle was just beginning. But thanks to John's years of preparation, Wind River Valley wasn't just fighting. Aback, it was revealing itself to be an impregnable fortress whose defenses had been quietly built long before Sterling ever arrived. Sterling's corporate jet touched down at the county airport just after midnight, but the man who emerged was markedly different from the arrogant businessman who had left 3 days earlier. Gone was the expensive suit, replaced by casual business. Aware, his previous bombastic confidence had transformed into something more focused, more dangerous. "He's adapting," John observed from the trading post's porch the next morning, watching Sterling's convoy roll past with less flash but more purpose. "Learning from his mistakes." Sarah handed him his usual coffee, noting the new lines of tension around his eyes. "That makes him more dangerous, doesn't it?" "Much more," John confirmed. "An enemy who learns is always more threatening than one who just relies on brute force." The first sign of Sterling's new approach came not from lawyers or corporate threats, but from a series of quiet meetings with key community members. He was offering partnerships now, not just buyouts, profit-sharing arrangements that on the surface seemed remarkably generous. "Divide and conquer," John explained to the gathered locals at the trading post. "He's realized he can't break us from the outside, so now he's trying to split us from within." But Sterling's research had gone deeper than just business tactics. A thick folder arrived at the trading post, addressed to Sarah. Inside were detailed after-action reports from John's SEAL missions, heavily redacted but still telling. Classified photos showed a younger John leading operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and places that officially didn't exist. "He's trying to scare you," John said, quietly, seeing her reaction to the images. "Show you the violence in my past, make you question who I really am." Sarah studied a photo of John receiving the Medal of Honor, his face younger but bearing the same quiet strength she knew now. "He doesn't understand, does he? This just shows you've been protecting people your whole life." The uniform changed, but the mission didn't. Something softened in John's expression, a moment of genuine emotion breaking through his tactical facade. But before he could respond, Tommy burst in with urgent news. "Sterling's meeting with the county commissioners. They're talking about eminent domain for infrastructure development." John was already moving, satellite phone in hand. "Chen, activate protocol Echo. Yes, full media package." He turned to the others. "Sterling's about to learn why all those infrastructure grants for the county had strings attached to them. Within hours, news broke that any eminent domain actions would trigger environmental impact reviews funded by several conservation trusts, trusts that Sarah suspected were quietly backed by Keystone Rural Development. "You really did think of everything," she said, watching Sterling's motorcade leave the county offices in obvious frustration. "In the SEALs, we learned to secure our objectives from every angle," John replied. "Sterling sees pieces on a chessboard. I see a community worth protecting." The afternoon brought another of Sterling's calculated moves. A reporter from the Wall Street Journal arrived, not for a hostile exposé, but for a detailed profile of John Mason, war hero, financial genius, and rural community defender. "He's trying to drag me into the spotlight," John explained, declining the interview. "Make this about personalities instead of principles. The more people focus on my past, the less they see what's really at stake here." But Sterling's most cunning move came last. He called a town hall meeting, not to push his development plans, but to announce a new charitable foundation dedicated to preserving Western heritage. The implied message was clear. He could be an ally instead of an enemy, if only John would negotiate. "Smart play," John admitted, watching the recorded announcement. "He's positioning himself as a potential partner while isolating me as the obstacle to community benefit." Sarah saw the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders. John had spent years building his defenses in secret, but now every move played out in public view. Sterling had forced him into the spotlight he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. "You could end this," she said softly. "Make a deal. Find a compromise." John's response carried the conviction of a man who had spent his life fighting for principles larger than himself. "Some things aren't for sale, Sarah. The moment we start compromising on what matters most is the moment we lose everything worth protecting." As night fell over the valley, the trading post's old walls seemed to hold their breath. Sterling had proven himself a more sophisticated opponent than anyone expected, but he still didn't understand what John had learned through years of combat and command. That true strength isn't found in tactics or resources, but in the unwavering defense of what you believe in. Sterling's next move struck at the heart of Wind River Valley. The Last Stand trading post received an official notice. The building failed to meet modern safety codes. Immediate repairs would be required, estimated at nearly $500,000, or the business would be shut down. He found a weak point, John said, examining the notice while Sarah paced the trading post's worn floorboards. The building's historical status protected it from regular inspections, but his lawyers found a loophole. $500,000. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "He knows I don't have that kind of money. The post has been struggling even before all this started." John watched her with quiet intensity. "Sarah, I could—" "No," she cut him off firmly. "Don't offer to pay for it. That's exactly what he wants, to make me dependent on either you or him. This post has stood on its own for 4 generations. I won't be the one who changes that." Something like pride flickered in John's eyes. Before he could respond, Jake Thompson burst through the door, his face flushed with anger. "They're seizing our water allotments," he announced to the gathered locals. Sterling's lawyers found some ancient claim dating back to the 1800s. They're filing injunctions to restrict access until ownership can be determined. John's satellite phone buzzed. After a brief conversation, his jaw tightened. "It's not just here. Sterling's attacking every business and ranch that stood against him. Bank loans suddenly being reviewed, permits questioned, surprise inspections." "He's trying to break us financially," Mary White Eagle observed. "Death by 1,000 cuts." Sarah watched John absorb the information, seeing the tactical mind behind his calm exterior, processing options and strategies. But she also saw something else: the growing personal cost of this fight. Each attack on the community seemed to weight on him, adding another layer of responsibility to shoulders already heavy with past burdens. "Why do you do it?" she asked quietly when the others had left to deal with their own crises. "You could live anywhere, do anything. Why choose this fight?" John was silent for a long moment, staring out at the mountains painted gold by the setting sun. In the SEALs, we had a saying, "You don't choose the mission chooses you." He turned to face her. "Every time I saw communities like this destroyed by corporate greed, something died. Not just businesses or ranches, but the heart of what makes this country special. So you became their defender," Sarah said softly, "trading one uniform for another." "Someone has to stand on the wall," he replied, then gave a slight smile, "even if the wall is just an old trading post." Their moment was interrupted by Tommy rushing in, his young face worried. "Mr. Mason, Sterling's calling another meeting. He's offering to drop all the legal actions, fund full repairs for the trading post, everything, if you'll just sell him controlling interest in the water rights." John's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw his hands tighten, almost imperceptibly, on his coffee cup. Sterling had found the perfect leverage. The community's suffering could end with a single signature. "He's not just attacking our businesses," Sarah realized. "He's attacking your conscience, making you responsible for our hardships." "It's a good tactical move," John admitted. "In combat, the hardest decisions aren't between right and wrong. They're between bad and worse." Sarah moved closer, her voice firm. "This isn't combat, John, and we're not your troops. We're your neighbors, your friends. We chose this fight too." As if to confirm her words, more community members began arriving at the trading post. Jake Thompson, Mary White Eagle, and dozens of others, all facing Sterling's pressure tactics, all refusing to break. "Sterling thinks he can isolate us," Jake announced, setting his worn hat on the counter. "Well, he doesn't know Wind River Valley. My grandfather used to say the strongest fence is the one where every post helps hold up the others." Mary nodded in agreement. "Our tribal elders teach that wealth isn't what you own, it's what you protect. Some things are worth fighting for." John looked around the trading post, at the faces of people who had chosen to stand their ground, not for profit, but for principle. His expression softened, showing a glimpse of the man behind the tactical genius and financial strategist. "Then we fight," he said simply. "But this time, we do it together." Sterling's pressure campaign had sought to divide the community. Instead, it had forged them into something stronger. As night fell over Wind River Valley, the last stand trading post glowed with warmth and determination. They were no longer just customers or neighbors. They were a community united in defense of something precious and irreplaceable. And John Mason, the quiet cowboy who had once commanded elite warriors, found himself leading a different kind of army. One armed not with weapons, but with unwavering resolve and unshakable bonds. The morning papers painted a grim picture. Sterling Ventures' latest SEC filings revealed a massive war chest dedicated to rural development opportunities. 3 corporate law firms specializing in hostile takeovers had been retained. Even more concerning were the private security contractors seen checking into local hotels. "He's mobilizing for a final push," John observed, scanning reports on his satellite phone while Sarah brewed the morning's first pot of coffee. The trading post had become their unofficial headquarters, opening earlier and closing later as the community coordinated their defense. "You're worried," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "Sterling's learned from his mistakes," John replied. "No more public confrontations or crude pressure tactics. He's moving pieces into position for something bigger." As if confirming his assessment, Tommy burst in with news from his morning drone flight. 3 different survey teams working the valley. They're mapping everything, roads, power lines, property boundaries, and they've got some kind of electronic equipment I've never seen before. John's expression tightened. Ground-penetrating radar. They're looking for our fiber optic lines. He turned to Sarah. Remember those internet infrastructure upgrades the Valley got last year? The ones your company subsidized. Sarah connected the dots. You weren't just improving internet access. You were building a secure communications network. Always secure your communications first. John nodded. Basic SEAL doctrine. Sterling's trying to map our defensive infrastructure. The satellite phone buzzed, Admiral Cooper with a warning. Sterling had been making inquiries about John's classified military record, particularly his counter-terrorism operations. The message was clear. The businessman was looking for anything he could use to tarnish John's reputation. He's trying to paint you as dangerous, Sarah said, overhearing the call. Turn the community against you. Standard psychological warfare. John's voice was calm, but Sarah saw the concern in his eyes. Discredit the leader, demoralize the resistance. Mary White Eagle arrived with more troubling news. Sterling's foundation was offering college scholarships to local kids, but with strings attached, their parents would need to support the development project. He was weaponizing people's dreams for their children. It's working on some folks, Mary admitted. When you're struggling to make ends meet, it's hard to turn down your kid's future. John absorbed the information with the focused intensity Sarah had come to recognize. The tactical mind, processing threats and formulating responses. But there was something else too, a weariness that showed the personal cost of leading this. Right, you can't save everyone, John, she said softly when they were alone. Learned that the hard way in Afghanistan, he replied, his voice distant. Lost 2 men trying to evacuate a village before the Taliban arrived. Couldn't save everyone then either. Sarah touched his arm gently, feeling the tension in his muscles. This isn't a war zone, isn't it? He gestured to the maps and reports scattered across the trading post's counter. Different weapons, same principles. Sterling's trying to destroy a way of life, just as surely as any enemy I've faced overseas. Their moment was interrupted by Jake Thompson's urgent arrival. Sterling's security contractors had been photographing residents, following vehicles, documenting routines. The psychological pressure was building. He's trying to make us feel under siege, John explained to the worried faces gathering in the trading post. Make us doubt ourselves, question our resolve. But Sterling had miscalculated. The very pressure meant to break them was instead revealing the true strength of what John had built. As each new threat emerged, the community drew closer together. Ranchers adjusted their schedules to watch over threatened properties. Mary's tribal network provided early warning of corporate movements. Even the local kids, led by Tommy, formed their own reconnaissance network. Sterling sees this valley as a tactical objective, John told Sarah, as they watched the sunset from the trading post's porch. He doesn't understand that some things can't be taken by force or bought with money. Sarah studied his profile, seeing both the warrior and the protector, the tactical genius and the quiet cowboy. And what do you see? Home, he answered simply. Something worth any price to defend. The word hung between them, carrying deeper meanings than either was ready to voice. As darkness fell over Wind River Valley, both knew that Sterling's next move would test not just their defenses, but the very bonds that held their community together. The truth arrived in a plain manila envelope, delivered not to John or the trading post, but to Sarah's home mailbox. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. You deserve to know who you're really fighting for. Sarah's hands trembled as she inserted the drive into her laptop. What filled her screen was beyond anything she'd expected. Classified military documents, corporate financial records, and surveillance photos spanning 2 decades. But it wasn't evidence against John Mason. It was the truth about Richard. Sterling, get everyone to the trading post, she told Jake Thompson over the phone. Now. By the time she arrived, the old building was packed with community members. John stood near his usual spot, watching her with quiet concern as she connected her laptop to the ancient TV they used for weather reports. "Before I show this," Sarah addressed the crowd, "everyone needs to understand Sterling didn't send this to expose John. He sent it to expose himself." The first document appeared on screen, a classified military report from Afghanistan, 2002. It detailed a covert operation gone wrong, where a young Special Forces captain named Richard Sterling had abandoned his team to protect private interests. The team survived, but Sterling's military career ended in disgrace. "That's why he hates you," Sarah turned to John. "You were there, weren't you?" John nodded slowly. "Led the rescue mission. Sterling had been secretly working with private military contractors, setting up his future business empire. When things went bad, he chose profit over his men." More documents followed. Sterling's rise in the private sector wasn't just about real estate development. His companies were fronts for a massive private military operation, using developed properties as staging areas for covert activities. The luxury resorts, the golf courses, all covered more sinister purposes. Wind River Valley isn't just another development project for him, Sarah explained. Its location, its isolation, its access to transportation routes, it's perfect for his real operation. The resort is just a cover, but why target the trading post specifically? Mary White Eagle asked. John's expression hardened as understanding dawned. Because the trading post sits at the valley's communication hub. All those infrastructure upgrades we did, the fiber optic lines, the secure networks, they're what he really wants. With control of this location, he could run his entire private military operation undetected. The revelation hit the community like a thunderbolt. They weren't just fighting a corporate takeover. They were standing in the way of a rogue military contractor's attempt to establish a covert base of operations on American soil. "There's more," Sarah said quietly, pulling up the final documents. "Sterling's not working alone. He's got backing from foreign interests, groups that would love to have a private military force operating from U.S. territory." Tommy, who had been studying the surveillance photos, suddenly pointed at the screen. "Those contractors he brought in, I recognize some of them from the classified files. They're not just security, they're his old military team." John was already on his satellite phone, speaking rapidly to Admiral Cooper. The implications were staggering. Sterling hadn't been trying to break their community. He'd been systematically working to control it, turn it into a cover for something far more dangerous. "All this time," Jake said slowly, "we thought we were defending our homes from a greedy corporation, but we were really standing in the way of a private army," John finished grimly. "Sterling's been building his force for years, hiding it behind legitimate businesses. Wind River Valley is supposed to be his command center." Sarah watched the community absorb this revelation, seeing fear mix with determination on their faces. The stakes had risen far beyond protecting their way of life. They were now the front line against a threat to national security. "He'll come at us harder now," John warned. "Sterling knows we have proof of his real operation. He can't afford to let this get out." As if on cue, the satellite phone buzzed with urgent reports. Sterling's contractors were mobilizing, moving equipment and personnel into position around the valley. This wasn't just another corporate maneuver, it was a military operation. "So what do we do?" Tommy asked, his young voice steady despite the fear. John straightened, and Sarah saw the SEAL commander emerge fully from behind the quiet cowboy. "Facade. We do what this community has always done. We stand together, but now we fight not just for our homes, but for something bigger." The trading post's old walls seemed to draw closer, as if gathering strength for the battle to come. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley that Sterling hoped to turn into his private kingdom. But he had miscalculated badly. In trying to destroy John Mason's reputation, he had instead exposed his own true nature, and in doing so, he had transformed a community's defensive stand into something far more powerful, a mission to protect not just their valley, but their nation itself. Sterling's response to being exposed came at dawn. The trading post's security cameras caught his convoy approaching, not the usual black SUVs, but military-grade vehicles carrying armed contractors. They moved with tactical precision, setting up a perimeter around the building. "He's dropped the pretense," John observed, watching through the old building's windows. "No more playing businessman. This is the real Sterling showing his face." Sarah had refused to leave when John suggested evacuating. "This post has stood against every threat for 4 generations, she said firmly. "It won't fall to a corrupt mercenary." Sterling emerged from the lead vehicle, his expensive suit replaced by tactical gear. Gone was any pretense of corporate refinement. This was the disgraced captain who had sacrificed his men for profit, now fully embracing his true nature. "Mason!" His voice carried across the empty street. "You've got something that belongs to me. Those files need to disappear, or this valley's about to have a tragic accident." The satellite phone buzzed. Admiral Cooper warning that federal response teams were en route, but they were still hours away. Sterling had timed his move perfectly, knowing he had a window of opportunity before official intervention arrived. "He's desperate," John told the gathered community members inside the trading post, "which makes him more dangerous than ever." Tommy's drone surveillance showed more of Sterling's contractors moving into position around the valley. They were targeting key infrastructure, power stations, communication hubs, water pumping stations. It was a military operation, executed under the guise of corporate security. "This is what he's always been," John explained, recognizing the tactical patterns. "Not a businessman playing soldier, but a soldier who used business as cover. Now he's showing his true colors." Sterling's voice crackled over a military-grade loudspeaker. "You've got 1 hour, Mason. Surrender the files, sign over the water rights, and everyone walks away. Refuse, and we'll show this community what real force looks like." But Sterling had miscalculated again. His show of force meant to intimidate. Instead, galvanized the community. Ranchers positioned their trucks to block access roads. Mary's tribal members moved silently through the backcountry, monitoring Sterling's positions. Even the local kids, using their social media networks, began documenting and broadcasting the military occupation of their valley. "He still thinks this is about force," Sarah said, watching John coordinate their response. "He never understood what really makes this community strong." John's satellite phone buzzed again, this time with unexpected news. His financial team had traced Sterling's backing to several foreign entities. The evidence was damning enough to trigger national security protocols. "Hold the line," John told his community. "Help is coming. We just need to stand firm." Sterling's hour was ticking down, but the man who had once abandoned his team to save himself was about to learn what real strength looked like. It wasn't found in weapons or threats, but in a community united against a common enemy, led by a quiet cowboy who had never forgotten the true meaning of duty and honor. The hour Sterling had given them was halfway gone, but inside the trading post, John Mason showed no signs of surrender. Instead, he had transformed the old building's back room into a tactical operations center, directing the community's defense with the calm precision that had made him a legendary SEAL commander. "Tommy's drones have spotted their backup units here and here," he indicated points on the valley map. "They're positioning for a 3-pronged assault, classic military doctrine, pin us down while flanking units move in." Sarah watched him work, seeing the warrior emerge fully from behind the quiet cowboy facade. Every move was calculated, every order clear and precise. The satellite phone hadn't stopped buzzing with updates from his network of contacts. "Sterling's got about 40 contractors," John continued, addressing the gathered community leaders, all ex-military, probably from his private force. They're well-equipped and trained for this kind of operation, and we're just farmers and ranchers, Jake Thompson said grimly. No, John corrected him. You're Americans defending your homes. That makes you more dangerous than any mercenary. The trading post had become a fortress of sorts. Local ranchers had positioned their heaviest equipment to block access routes. Mary White Eagle's family members, many of them veterans themselves, had established observation posts in the surrounding hills. Even the local kids were playing their part, using social media to document every move Sterling's forces made. "Sir," Tommy called from his monitoring station, where multiple tablets showed feeds from his drone network. "They're moving some kind of heavy equipment into position. Looks military grade." John studied the footage, his expression tightening. "Breaching equipment. They're planning to take the trading post by force." "Can we hold them off until help arrives?" Sarah asked quietly. "We don't need to beat them," John replied. "We just need to stall them. Every minute we resist is another minute for federal response teams to get closer." The satellite phone buzzed. Again, Admiral Cooper with an update. "National Guard units are mobilizing, but Sterling's people have blocked the main roads into the valley. They'll have to come in by air, and this weather's making that tricky." Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, as if nature itself was preparing for the coming battle. Sterling's voice crackled over the loudspeaker again, tension evident in his tone. 30 minutes, Mason. Don't make me do this the hard way. You know what my men are capable of." "He's right about one thing," John told Sarah when the others had moved to their positions. "His men are dangerous. They're trained killers who follow money instead of duty. That makes them unpredictable." "And what makes you different?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "I follow something stronger than money," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. "I follow my conscience, and right now, that means protecting this community no matter the cost." The next update from Tommy showed Sterling's forces methodically cutting power and communication lines. They were isolating the valley, preparing for their assault. But John had anticipated this too. "They don't know about our backup systems," he explained, as hidden generators kicked in and secured satellite links maintained their connection to the outside world. "Sterling thinks he's dealing with a simple rural community. He forgot that. I've spent years preparing for exactly this kind of situation." Sarah watched him coordinate their defenses, seeing both the tactical genius and the man who had chosen to make their valley his home. "You knew something like this might happen, didn't you? That's why all the preparations, the hidden security measures. In the SEALs, we learned to hope for the best, but plan for the worst," John acknowledged. "Sterling's not the first person to think he could take what isn't his by force, but he's about to learn why that's always a mistake." The community members moved with purpose now, fear replaced by determination. They had faced down corporate threats and legal pressure, but this was different. This was a fight for everything they held dear, led by a man who had spent his life preparing for such moments. "Remember," John addressed them one final time as Sterling's deadline approached. "We're not just defending a building or even a community. We're standing against something that threatens the very heart of what America means. Each of you knows this valley, knows every trail and hill. Use that knowledge. Stay smart, stay coordinated, and remember, we're not trying to win a war. We're just holding the line until reinforcements arrive." Thunder rolled across the valley. As the storm drew closer, through the trading post's windows, they could see Sterling's forces taking up assault positions. The hour was almost up, and the real battle was about to begin. With 5 minutes left on Sterling's ultimatum, the storm broke over Wind River Valley. Rain hammered the trading post's old roof, while lightning illuminated Sterling's forces in stark flashes. Their tactical gear and weapons a jarring contrast to the historic building they surrounded. Inside, John made his final rounds, checking positions and offering quiet words of encouragement. He found Sarah in her office, carefully placing the Trading posts historic documents and photographs into a waterproof safe. My great-grandfather's original deed, she explained, holding up a yellowed paper. He believed this post would stand for generations, that it would always be here for the community. It will be. John's voice carried absolute conviction. Sterling doesn't understand what he's really fighting. This isn't just a building. It's the heart of everything we're defending. The satellite phone buzzed one last time. Admiral Cooper with a final update. The National Guard was 30 minutes out, but the storm was forcing their helicopters to take an indirect route. They would have to hold out against whatever Sterling had planned. You know, Sarah said softly, when you first started coming here, I thought you were just a quiet cowboy who liked his coffee black and his mornings peaceful. I never imagined that I was preparing for war. John finished with a slight smile. Neither did Sterling. That's what gives us our advantage. Tommy rushed in from his surveillance position, tablet in hand. Mr. Mason, they're moving the breaching equipment into position, and he hesitated. Sterling's putting on body armor. He's going to lead the assault himself. Of course he is. John nodded. His ego won't let him delegate this. He needs to prove he's still the soldier he pretends to be. Through the windows, they could see Sterling organizing his men into assault teams. The disgraced captain had come full circle, from abandoning his military brothers to commanding mercenaries against American civilians. This is your last chance, Mason. Sterling's voice boomed over the storm. Surrender the files, or we take them by force. John moved to the trading post's front door, his stance relaxed but alert. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the rain-swept space between them. You forgot the first rule they taught us, Sterling. The mission isn't about personal glory or profit. It's about protecting what matters. Protecting. Sterling laughed harshly. Look around you, Mason. You're surrounded by professional military contractors with state-of-the-art weapons. What are you going to fight us with, farmers and ranchers? No, John replied calmly. I'm going to fight you with Americans who believe in something stronger than money, something you forgot about a long time ago. Mary White Eagle appeared at John's side, her voice carrying quiet strength. Our ancestors defended this valley for generations. We're not about to stop now. Jake Thompson joined them, followed by other community members. Each face showed the same determination, the same unwavering resolve. They were no longer just neighbors. They were a community united against a common threat. Last warning, Sterling called, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. This wasn't going according to his tactical playbook. These people should have been cowering, not standing defiant. Inside, John gathered everyone for final instructions. Remember your positions. Stay in contact. Don't try to be heroes. We just need to hold out until help arrives. Sarah watched. Him, seeing both the tactical commander and the man who had chosen their valley as his home, their community as his family. John, she said softly, when this is over. He turned to her, and for a moment the soldier's mask slipped, showing something deeper, more personal. When this is over, he promised, we'll have that conversation we've been avoiding. Thunder crashed overhead as Sterling's forces moved into their final assault positions. The trading post's old walls seemed to gather strength, as if drawing upon generations of history to prepare for their greatest test. Whatever happens, John told his community, his family, remember, Sterling thinks he's fighting for profit. We're fighting for something far more valuable. That makes us stronger than any weapon he can bring against us. The storm raged, the ultimatum expired, and Wind River Valley held its breath for the battle to come. Sterling's assault began with a display of overwhelming force. Breaching charges detonated against the trading post's back doors, while tactical teams rushed forward through the storm, their weapons ready. But John had anticipated this move, just as he'd anticipated everything else. Now, he said quietly into his radio, the valley came alive with coordinated resistance. Local ranchers activated industrial floodlights, cutting through the rain to blind the assault teams. Jake Thompson's irrigation systems burst to life, turning carefully chosen approaches into mud pits that bogged down Sterling's forces. "They're splitting up," Tommy reported from his drone surveillance. "Two teams trying to flank east, main force still pushing the front." John's response was immediate and precise. "Mary, light up the east. Jake, give them something to think about. Signal." Flares soared from hidden positions in the hills, illuminating Sterling's flanking teams in harsh red light. At the same time, Jake's ranch hands released his cattle herd, the spooked animals charging through the mercenaries' formation and shattering their careful tactical approach. "This isn't possible!" Sterling's voice crackled with rage over their compromised radio channel. "They're just civilians." "No," John replied calmly into his own radio. "They're Americans defending their home, and you just made the biggest mistake of your life." The trading post's defenses proved more sophisticated than Sterling's intelligence had suggested. Every attempt to breach the building met with carefully prepared countermeasures. Not lethal force. John had been explicit about that. But the kind of tactical thinking that had made him a legend in special operations. "East team is bogged down," Tommy reported with barely contained excitement. "Mary's people have them pinned in the old creek bed. West team just ran into Jake's barricades. They're not going anywhere." Inside the trading post, John moved with fluid efficiency between defensive positions, coordinating the community's response while Sarah maintained communications with approaching National Guard units. The storm that Sterling thought would delay their rescue was about to become their greatest ally. Getting frustrated, Sterling, John's voice carried across the battlefield, finding out the difference between mercenaries and people fighting for something real. Sterling's response was to order his men to target the trading post's power sources, but when they reached the transformer station, they found it protected by an impromptu barrier of farm equipment with local teenagers recording their every move on phones that broadcasted directly to social media. "You don't get it, do you?" John continued, knowing his words were affecting Sterling's men. "You think everything has a price, that enough money and force can buy anything. But you can't buy what we have here." The storm intensified, but the community's coordination never faltered. Every move Sterling's forces made was met with prepared countermeasures. Local knowledge and commitment proved more valuable than military hardware and mercenary training. "Sir," Tommy's voice was urgent, "Sterling's moving to the front personally. He's carrying something." Through the rain-streaked windows, they saw Sterling approaching with a military-grade demolition charge, the kind that could bring down the entire trading post. "Enough games, Mason," Sterling shouted over the storm. "Face me yourself, or I bring this whole place down with everyone inside." John moved toward the door, but Sarah caught his arm. "John, trust me," he said softly. "Sterling's about to learn his final lesson." The trading post's front door opened, and John Mason stepped out into the storm. Gone was any pretense of the quiet cowboy. He moved with the deadly grace of a SEAL commander, every step calculated and precise. "You wanted this confrontation from the beginning," John said, his voice carrying clearly despite the thunder. "Ever since Afghanistan, ever since I exposed what you really are. You destroyed my military career." Sterling's fury erupted. "Everything I've built since then was to prove I'm better than you and your self-righteous code." "No," John replied calmly. "You destroyed your own career when you chose profit over duty. Everything since then has just been you running from that truth." Sterling raised the demolition charge. "I'm going to end this my way." "Look around you," John commanded. "Really look." Lightning flashed, illuminating the valley. Sterling's mercenaries were completely contained, surrounded not by military force, but by unified community action. Local law enforcement had arrived, coordinating with Mary's tribal police. News helicopters circled overhead, having been quietly summoned by Tommy's social media campaign. Your men are already standing down, John continued. They're professionals, and they know a lost cause when they see one. The only question is whether you'll finally learn the lesson you missed in Afghanistan. Which is? Sterling snarled. That true strength isn't found in weapons or money. John stepped closer, unthreatening but implacable. It's found in the things worth defending, in the people willing to stand together against men like you. The sound of helicopters grew louder. National Guard units approaching fast. Sterling's remaining forces were already surrendering, recognizing the futility of their position. The disgraced captain looked around wildly, seeing his carefully planned operation crumbling. This was never about beating us militarily, John said quietly. This was about showing that a community united can't be bought, bullied, or broken. Your mistake was thinking you could take by force what can only be earned through trust and respect. Sterling's hand tightened on the demolition charge, but before he could act, a precise shot from Mary's position knocked it from his grip. In the next instant, John closed the distance between them. The hand-to-hand combat was brief but decisive. A SEAL commander versus a man who had abandoned his principles for profit. Sterling went down hard, and John secured him with the same quiet efficiency he showed in everything else. As National Guard units landed and federal agents swarmed the valley, the storm began to clear. The trading post still stood proud, its old walls having witnessed yet another chapter in the valley's history. Inside, the community gathered, no longer just neighbors but veterans of a shared battle. They had faced down a private military force not with superior weapons, but with unshakable unity and the strategic guidance of a quiet cowboy who had become their guardian. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, as federal agents led Sterling away. John looked around at the faces of his community, his family, and smiled. "Now we go back to being who we've always been, just a little stronger for having faced this together." The sun broke through the clouds, painting the valley in shades of gold. Sterling's mercenary force would face federal charges. His corporate empire, built on corruption and hidden military contracts, would crumble under investigation. But in Wind River Valley, the last stand trading post would continue as it always had, a gathering place for a community that had discovered its true strength. And if anyone wondered about the quiet cowboy who had led them through their darkest hour, they needed only to look at the way the community now carried itself, with the quiet confidence of people who knew exactly who they were and what they stood for. A month after Sterling's defeat, the last stand trading post hummed with its usual morning activity. The bullet holes had been patched, the old walls standing stronger than ever, now bearing proud scars from their greatest test. John Mason sat in his usual spot, reading his Wall Street Journal, while Sarah brewed the morning coffee. But things had changed in subtle ways. The satellite phone on the counter now sat in plain view. His quiet authority was acknowledged openly rather than quietly observed. "Sterling's sentencing is today," Sarah mentioned, sliding his coffee across. "The counter," John nodded. "Federal prosecutors found connections to foreign military interests. He'll be away for a long time." The trading post door chimed as Tommy burst in, excitement radiating from him. "Mr. Mason!" The governor's office called. They're designating Wind River Valley as a protected cultural heritage site. No corporate development can happen without community approval. John smiled slightly. Interesting timing, almost like someone's been working behind the scenes. Sarah caught his meaning and shook her head fondly. Even now, he was still protecting them, using his influence quietly but effectively. The morning crowd began filtering in, Jake Thompson, Mary White Eagle, and others who had stood together during the crisis. They moved differently now, with the quiet confidence of people who had discovered their true strength. "You know," Sarah said when they had a moment alone, "you never did finish that conversation we were going to have after everything was over." John set down his paper, his eyes meeting hers with warmth that had nothing to do with tactical considerations or strategic planning. "Seems to me," he said quietly, "some things don't need much talking about. Just doing." Outside, the morning sun painted Wind River Valley in shades of promise. The trading post stood as it always had, not just a business or a building, but the heart of a community that had learned its greatest strength lay not in walls or weapons, but in the bonds between its people. And if anyone asked about the quiet cowboy who had led them through their darkest hour, they would simply smile and say he was exactly where he belonged, home,